Picture a church so big it has its own zip code of influence. A dome so massive it was once the largest house of worship in the entire United States. And a founder so financially disciplined he refused to let his congregation take on a single dollar of debt while building it. Now picture that same institution, more than 50 years after it started with just 300 people in a rented building in Inglewood, California, quietly closing the doors of the school it ran for 4 decades. This is the story of Crenshaw Christian Center, the FaithDome, and the family fighting to keep a Black American religious empire alive in an era when the megachurch model itself is under threat. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll understand not just what happened to one church, but what it reveals about the future of faith, real estate, and legacy in America. Let's start at the beginning, because you cannot understand the crisis without understanding the miracle that came before it. In November of 1973, a preacher named Frederick K.C. Price stood in front of roughly 300 people in Inglewood, California, and started a church called Crenshaw Christian Center. Price wasn't some overnight sensation. He'd already spent years pastoring a small congregation, growing dissatisfied with the results he was getting and searching for something more. That search led him to a Holy Spirit baptism experience in February of 1970, and shortly after, he encountered the teachings of Kenneth E. Hagin, a pioneer of what's known as the Word of Faith movement. Price took those principles centered on faith, healing, and yes, prosperity, and built something extraordinary. By the late 1970s, Crenshaw Christian Center had outgrown its original home. Average attendance across 3 Sunday services had climbed to around 5,500 people, and Price's message was already spreading beyond the walls of any single building. In April of 1978, the ministry's outreach arm, called Ever Increasing Faith, began televising Price's sermons locally. Within a few years, those broadcasts had expanded into 5 major American cities. This mattered enormously, because Price would go on to become the first Black minister in American history to host a nationally syndicated religious television program. That's not a small footnote. That's a structural shift in how faith, especially Black Christian faith, was broadcast and consumed across the entire country. In 1981, with the congregation bursting at the seams, Crenshaw Christian Center purchased a 32-acre campus in South Los Angeles that had previously belonged to Pepperdine University before that school relocated to Malibu. Think about that for a second. A congregation that started with 300 people in a rented space was now buying an entire former university campus. And what they built there became the defining image of the ministry. Construction began in 1986 on a geodesic dome sanctuary, and when it was completed in the fall of 1989, it opened with 10,145 seats. They called it the FaithDome, and at the time, it was officially the largest house of worship in the United States, a title it would hold until Lakewood Church in Houston, home of Joel Osteen, surpassed it in 2005 with a 16,000-seat arena. But here's the detail that made Price's achievement genuinely remarkable in the world of televangelism. The FaithDome was built completely debt-free. No loans, no mortgages hanging over the ministry. Price was famous for insisting his congregation never take on financial obligations they couldn't immediately cover, a discipline that stood in sharp contrast to the boom and bust financial stories that plagued so many other televangelism empires of that era. Of course, Crenshaw Christian Center wasn't immune to controversy, and it's worth being honest about that too. In the 1990s, the ABC news program 2020 aired an investigative segment called Enough. that examined how some of the country's largest, wealthiest ministries were handling their congregants' tithes and offerings. The segment featured a portion of a CCC service in which Price, speaking in character to make an illustrative point about wealth, was shown in a way that stripped out the context and made it appear he was boasting about his own riches directly. Price sued for defamation, and ABC ultimately apologized both on air and in writing. It's a moment that captures something important about the prosperity gospel movement as a whole. The tension between genuine financial empowerment teaching aimed at a historically underserved Black community and the very real skepticism from outside observers about wealth accumulation inside the church. By the time the 21st century rolled around, Crenshaw Christian Center's membership numbers had grown to a reported 28,000 people, making it one of the largest churches of any racial or denominational background in the entire country. In 2009, Price began transitioning leadership, formally installing his son, Frederick K. Price Jr., as senior pastor. This wasn't unusual for megachurches built around a single charismatic founder. Succession planning, especially succession that keeps leadership inside the family, is one of the most common patterns in American religious institutions, and CCC followed that pattern closely. But succession is never as smooth as an installation ceremony makes it look. And CCC's transition would prove that in dramatic fashion. In June of 2017, Fred Price Jr. stepped down from the pulpit, citing what he described only as serious personal misjudgments that had affected his life and his family. The church didn't publicly disclose the specifics. What we do know is that for roughly a year, Price Jr. was out of the pulpit while, according to church officials, he and his wife worked through a restorative process that included weekly attendance and efforts to repair his family relationships. Then, on July 1st of 2018, in a Sunday service that read almost like a homecoming, Fred Price Jr. returned to the pulpit. His mother, Betty Price, who had co-founded the ministry alongside her husband, stood before the congregation and referenced the biblical baptism of Jesus, saying, quote, "And now my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." It was an emotional, very public reconciliation for a very public family, and it set the stage for what came next, because less than 3 years later, the man who had built the entire empire would be gone. Frederick K.C. Price died on February 12, 2021, at the age of 89. The cause was complications from COVID-19. His daughter, Angela Price Evans, later told local news that it started with what seemed like a simple bad cough. Weeks later, he was gone, one of the hundreds of thousands of Americans lost during that brutal stretch of the pandemic. His body lay in repose at the church for 2 days in early March, and a memorial service was live-streamed to a global audience that had, over decades, come to know him through television screens in their living rooms as much as through in-person attendance. It's worth sitting with the scale of that loss for a second. This was a man who had personally overseen the growth of a congregation from 300 people to tens of thousands, who had pioneered national religious broadcasting for Black ministers, and who had built one of the largest church buildings in American history without ever taking on debt. And now, the entire institution had to figure out how to survive without him. The good news, from the perspective of institutional continuity, is that leadership was already settled. Fred Price Jr. remained senior pastor, a role he'd held minus that year-long absence since 2009. Betty Price, his mother and the ministry's co-founder, continued to be a central figure in the church's leadership structure. And Angela Price Evans, the daughter who had spoken so movingly about her father's final days, took on a formal executive role. eventually becoming CEO of Crenshaw Christian Center. In other words, this wasn't a church scrambling to find new leadership after its founder's death. This was a family-run institution where the succession plan had, on paper, already been executed years earlier. The real challenge wasn't who would lead. The real challenge was what a church built entirely around one man's television presence and one man's physical dome would look like in a world where both televangelism and physical megachurch attendance were fundamentally changing. And that brings us to 2026, and the piece of news that's actually driving renewed attention to this story. In February of 2026, Angela Price Evans, in her role as CEO, sent a letter to the families connected to the Frederick K.C. Price III Christian schools, informing them that after 40 years of operation, the school would be closing at the end of the 2025 to 2026 academic year. For the K through 12 grades, that meant a final day of June 10th, 2026, for the preschool program. The closure date was set for June 30th, 2026. To understand why this hit so hard, you have to understand what this school actually was. It wasn't just a side project. It was founded in 1985 as a childcare center, and it carried deep personal significance because it was established as a memorial to Angela's late brother, Frederick K.C. Price III, who had been killed in a car accident at just 8 years old. Over the following years, the school expanded, adding an elementary program in 1986, a middle school in 1987, and finally a high school in 1992, giving families a complete preschool through 12th grade Christian education experience all on one campus. In 2013, its name was formally updated to Frederick K.C. Price III Christian Schools to fully reflect its Christian educational mission. By any measure, this was not a failing school academically. Over its 4 decades, it educated more than 10,000 students. It maintained what the church itself describes as a 100% high school graduation rate going back to 1996. And a similarly perfect track record of graduates being accepted into 4-year colleges and universities, including schools like Stanford, Dartmouth, Georgetown, Berkeley, UCLA, and USC. Its graduates secured more than $1 million in college scholarships over the years, and more than 10% of alumni eventually returned to the school community as teachers, coaches, mentors, or parents of the next generation of students. This wasn't a struggling institution academically, it was a struggling institution financially, and that distinction matters enormously for understanding what's actually happening to churches like this one across the country. In her letter, Angela Price Evans was direct about the reasoning. The school had, since its inception, been heavily subsidized by Crenshaw Christian Center itself, allowing it to operate at a level tuition alone could never sustain. But by early 2026, she wrote, continuing that level of subsidy was, in her words, no longer possible nor sustainable. This wasn't the first brush with closure, either, back in 2018. The school had come dangerously close to shutting its doors, a crisis that was only staved off at the time thanks to additional support from the church. But 8 years later, with declining enrollment and the inability to raise tuition high enough to cover the gap, without pricing out the community it was meant to serve, the math simply didn't work anymore. Parents, according to local reporting, were largely blindsided by the announcement, with some noting that everything had seemed fine as recently as the previous fall's orientation. It's a painful, very human detail buried inside a much larger institutional story. Real families, real kids, finding out with only a few months' notice that the school community they'd built their lives around was ending. So here's the bigger question this raises, and it's the question that should really hook you into thinking harder about this story. How does an institution that owns a debt-free 32-acre campus in South Los Angeles, complete with a 10,000-plus seat dome that was once the largest church building in America, end up unable to sustain a K-12 school with a genuinely excellent academic track record? The answer isn't really about mismanagement. It's about a structural shift happening across almost every historic American megachurch built in the television era. These institutions were designed around a specific formula, a singular, charismatic, nationally broadcast founder driving both membership growth and financial giving, an in-person congregation large enough to fill a massive physical space every single week, and a media distribution model built on cable and syndicated television. Every single piece of that formula has been disrupted. Founders age and pass away, and even the most beloved successor rarely commands the same pull. In-person weekly attendance across American Christianity broadly has been declining for years, a trend that accelerated sharply during the pandemic and never fully reversed for many congregations. And television itself, the very medium that made Frederick K.C. Price a household name in Black communities across the country, has been fragmented into 100 different streaming and social platforms competing for the same eyeballs. Crenshaw Christian Center's response to all of this has actually been fairly savvy, and it's worth giving credit where it's due. Rather than trying to force the old model to keep working, the church has leaned hard into repurposing what it already owns outright. That debt-free 32-acre campus, remember, isn't just a sanctuary. It's real estate with genuine civic utility in South Los Angeles, and the church has increasingly positioned it that way, serving as a site for public health initiatives like immunization drives and health screenings for the surrounding community. That's a meaningful pivot. Instead of a megachurch existing purely to fill seats for a weekly broadcast, it becomes a piece of civic infrastructure that happens to also be a church, embedding itself into the practical, everyday needs of the neighborhood around it. At the same time, the ever-increasing faith media ministry that Price built starting all the way back in 1978 continues to broadcast, keeping the global reach of the ministry alive even as the physical dome sees fewer people filling its 10,000 seats on any given Sunday. Today, according to the church's own leadership materials, Fred Price Jr. leads a congregation described as roughly 8,000 members, a very different number from the 28,000 once associated with the ministry at its peak. That gap between the historic high and the current reality tells you almost everything you need to know about the pressures facing not just this church, but historic Black megachurches across the country built on the same broadcasting era model. There's also something worth pausing on about who's actually leading this next chapter. This isn't simply a story about a son inheriting his father's pulpit. It's increasingly a story about a daughter, Angela Price Evans, stepping into a formal executive leadership role and making the kind of difficult, unsentimental financial decisions that keeping a legacy institution alive actually requires. Closing a school named after your own late brother. A school your family personally subsidized for decades is not an easy call to make, and it's not the kind of decision that generates warm headlines. But it's exactly the kind of decision that determines whether an institution like Crenshaw Christian Center survives the next 50 years or slowly bleeds out trying to preserve every piece of what it used to be. In some ways, it mirrors what's happening at other historic megachurches and religious media empires across the country right now, as second and third generation leaders inherit not just pulpits, but aging real estate portfolios, declining broadcast relevance, and congregations that increasingly want to engage with faith on their phones rather than in a 10,000-seat dome on a Sunday morning. So where does that leave Crenshaw Christian Center heading into the rest of 2026 and beyond? The FaithDome itself isn't going anywhere. It remains a debt-free asset, an architectural landmark visible to thousands of airline passengers landing at LAX every single day, and a genuine piece of Black American religious history. The Price family's leadership line remains intact, with Fred Price Jr. in the pulpit, Betty Price as a continuing spiritual matriarch, and Angela Price Evans running the institutional and business side of things. But the ministry is clearly in the middle of a difficult recalibration, trimming what it can no longer sustain, like the school, while trying to find new relevance for what it still owns outright, like the campus and the broadcast network. Whether that recalibration succeeds will likely become a case study for dozens of other aging American megachurches facing the exact same math in the years ahead. Charismatic founders who cannot be replaced, physical infrastructure that costs a fortune to maintain, and a media landscape that has moved on from the very broadcasting model that built these empires in the first place. Frederick K.C. Price spent his life building something that was supposed to outlast him, a debt-free monument to faith and financial discipline sitting on land that once belonged to a completely different institution's dreams. 5 years after his death, his family is discovering that keeping a legacy alive is a very different task from building one in the first place. It requires not just faith, but hard, sometimes heartbreaking decisions about what to let go of in order to protect what matters most. If you found this breakdown of Crenshaw Christian Center's story valuable, make sure you're subscribed, because we're covering more stories about the institutions, empires, and legacies shaping American religious and cultural history, and you won't want to miss what we dig into next.